Hey everyone, welcome to the July 23rd edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. I'm David Aragona, and this week on the podcast, we are looking ahead to Saturday's card at Del Mar. I was looking across the country at the stake schedule this week, and those Saratoga stakes came up a little bit light. Usually I would discuss those, so some of the other races on the card are decent, but I thought this week maybe we could shift focus to the West Coast, something that I don't often do on this podcast, and go over the entire late pick 5 sequence at Del Mar on Saturday, which includes a couple of graded stakes races, the Eddie Reed and the San Clemente, both on the turf. And returning to help me handicap these races is OptixEQ partner Emily Gullikson, who last joined me for the Stephen Foster card at Churchill about a month ago, and we gave out some decent opinions on that card, so hopefully we can do some more of the same here. Emily, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And I'm glad you picked the sequence and card. I think it's a good one, and it's a fun one that I'm looking forward to talking about and hearing your opinions in these races.
Yeah, I was pleasantly surprised when I looked up these stakes races, which kind of anchor this sequence in the middle, because sometimes these California turf stakes come up a little bit light, especially the ones for the older horses. It feels like those divisions can be a little bit thin, but this year, especially in the Eddie Reed, seems like we've got a really beefed up division of California turf horses.
Yeah, and it gets a little bit different just being Del Mar. And I think even this year at Del Mar, we're getting a lot of trainers that are willing to ship back in, which is fun and it's exciting, and it just adds more pieces to the puzzle.
Now, you follow California racing much more closely than I do, and I know the meet just began, but have you noticed anything that really noteworthy, any like trends or track biases or stuff like that to pay attention to before we kind of dive into these races?
You know, I think it's been pretty fair, and I know that's probably a contrary opinion because I think people were kind of under the impression that it was like outside flow favoring. But I think when you look at kind of the whole picture, especially somebody that like watches races and follows the circuit, and you get results that maybe the horses on the outside are winning, but they're also horses that are really logical just based on their form cycle and speed and the way the race shape played out. You kind of have to factor those in as well as where the horses were coming from. And I think sometimes people can just be a little bit quick, maybe a little bit lazy to go, oh, all the horses are coming from there, so there must be an outside favoring profile, where the horses on the inside were probably not quite good enough, didn't get the right pace, didn't get the right trip, and those factors came into play. So I think it was, in terms of the track itself, playing a little bit fair. You know, obviously we'll see things change. It can change day to day, and the turf, the rails moving in and out, so that could impact. As far as trends, I think that's super important too. I think overall trainer stats and like history, people can get kind of maybe put too much weight into that, where I tend to lean more on recency and following trends. There's certain barns that like Baltus is sending out horses that are not only live, but literally running off the screen. So I think that's important to pay attention to. Bob Baffert, in my opinion, I think the horses are a little bit cold. It'll be interesting with this sequence. And I believe on Sunday's card with some of the juvenile runners, which is a category he typically dominates here at Del Mar, how those horses run before kind of making a full assessment. But those are just kind of a couple of my thoughts, and I'm sure I'll kind of add on to that as we go through these races and kind of find some trainers along the way.
I think that's actually a perfect segue into the first race we're going to talk about, which begins this late pick 5 sequence, the 7th race, going 5.5 furlongs on the dirt for 2-year-old maidens, a race that's just loaded with first-time starters. And as you said, Bob Baffert usually is so dominant in these races. I was looking up some statistics for all of these trainers in Formulator before we came on, and over the past 5 years with 2-year-old firsters in dirt sprints at Del Mar, Bob Baffert's 37 for 87. That's a 43% win rate with a 223 ROI. It's just fantastic for a trader who typically gets bet pretty heavily. So he's got the number 1 in here, Mirasol, who is one of many horses who's listed at 3-1 in the morning line. And it's a pet peeve of mine, this indecisive morning line. I don't know how that's helpful.
But yeah, but I mean, I don't know, like as a morning line maker, and especially, you know, you just read off that statistic, and I'm following Del Mar. I mean, there was it last year, maybe the year before, where he was like close to 80% when Van Dyke was aboard on these juvenile first-time starters, which is just like outrageous. But the fact that Mirasol is one of 3-1 horses and not even the morning line favorite is a little chilly. Wouldn't you say, as a morning line maker?
I would. I sometimes certain line makers just don't like to take a stand in these races, which I understand. There's a lot of guesswork to be done. I always try to take a little bit of a stand just to try to guide the public a little bit, but that's just my perspective on it. Everybody has a different one. But regardless, they're all first time starters that we're going to be talking about in this race for the most part, I would imagine. And I think the conversation does kind of have to start with Mirasol because of Bob Baffert's dominance in these races, and also I know you're not the biggest pedigree fan, but this one does have a huge pedigree on the dam side. This dam, Just Whistle Dixie, has thrown nothing but runners, including New Year's Day, Mohayman, even Enforceable and Kingsley, who haven't been graded stakes winners like the other two, but have been very nice horses at the stakes and allowance level. So Miragate is from that first crop of Arrogate, who I don't think has sired a winner yet, but he hasn't had as many starters as some other first crop sires. So, I watched some of this one's workouts on XBTV. I'm not getting the typical live Baffert vibes from this one. And like you said, that feels like the Baffert barn has been a little bit cold. So how would you assess this horse?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think, having the access to watching these replays is so key. And that's, I mean, to me, like you mentioned, like I'm not a big pedigree person, especially when I can watch a work, because that'll tell me so much more about this horse. And the same thing, not quite getting those vibes. And then also keeping in mind, she's drawn the rail, and I'm sure you saw in those works, she can be kind of hit or miss as far as breaking cleanly. So she breaks a little bit slow from the inside. That could be tough to overcome with some of these other horses in the field. And then, well, maybe has to show speed. So I wasn't getting that feeling. She worked, was a little bit best over a workmate called Midnight Mammoth, a horse that was favored. I can believe it's a Calbred that didn't run very well and took a lot of money during opening week. So, certainly capable, but I just kind of prefer some of these others in the field.
Yeah, the horse that's listed as the slight favorite here, Honor It, going out for the Richard Mandela Bard. When you watch the workouts, this is the one that really has the knockout drills in the morning, especially the last couple of drills. It seems like the light bulb's gone on for her, and she has just been so in the bridle, tugging at her rider under a hammerlock in the morning, almost bordering on too aggressive. What do you make of workouts like that?
Yeah, no, the same thing. I mean, I think that there's, she's high energy. She wants to go, and you really can't mess around in the morning. It's like you can try to rate because obviously, you don't need to have them run off in the morning. That's not going to do them any good. And try to get them some practice and to settle. But I think in the race, once it once those doors open, I think rating would probably be to her detriment, that they would just let her run. And Pratt's aboard. He's a strong rider, so it's not like she's gonna, fully just be like out of control on the front end. But she's definitely going to use her speed, and that's an asset. She's been working with some solid rivals, some older horses, so there's plenty of foundation and speed there. I think she's a definite kind of must use in this spot.
Yeah, I think the only real negative with her is that Richard Mandela, like a lot of other trainers in this race, just doesn't have very strong stats with first-time starters, especially with two-year-old firsters. Actually, over the past 5 years, Mandela is just 1 for 32 with two-year-old first-time starters in dirt sprints. So that's not a great statistic for a horse that's going to be a short price. If you look through that sample, there are a lot of horses that hit the board. I think there were 8 second-place finishers to go along with that one victory. So perhaps it's just a little bit of random distribution and luck that he hasn't had more winners. But it's just a little cause for pause with a horse that probably is going to take quite a bit of money off those flashy workouts.
Yes, yeah, she could. But again, you mentioned there's a few others in here that are also short on the morning line. So I think even if she is favored, I don't think she'll be that. I mean, I'm not really looking to like necessarily go out and bet this race as far as like a win end. But since we're talking about it in terms of a sequence, being one to use. And I mean, in terms of the stats, again, I'm kind of more on recency and putting the horse first. And I know he's been able to win with first time starters, maybe not necessarily juvenile. So I think it's worth keeping in mind, but not necessarily a reason that I wouldn't play a horse that I think is certainly capable in the spot that it's running in.
So from like a pick five standpoint, who would you be looking to kind of emphasize in this race to try to just kind of move ahead to the next leg?
Well, I think Honor It is a must use, and I'm also going to mention Mitigation because there's something like really interesting about this horse. She's training at San Luis Rey, and she was actually training for a Cliff Sice. And so, when you mention these trainer stats, and people will be like, "Oh, John Sheriff's like he doesn't necessarily win first out or whatever," but it's another trainer that's been having a really good meet so far with limited starters, so certainly coming in live. But Cliff Sice has been training her, and he's capable with first-time starters. And then she has a work here at Del Mar, which was just more of a conditioning practice over the surface. And I just think it's really interesting that that change is made, why they would move barns. And the ownership is not necessarily moving all their horses away from size. So it's just kind of one of those kind of strange things that you're like, that's interesting. In a live barn at this meet, that horse is definitely going to get used. That's the number 2 mitigation. So kind of her and Honor It are kind of the ones I'm keying off of. Dance to the Music, I think fits as well. She's had plenty of foundation, a lot of practice coming out of the gate and improving in her most recent drills. So I think she's coming into this race pretty live as well. Is that one that you kind of caught your eye in terms of works?
Yeah, we're pretty much on the same page here. I mean, I wouldn't totally dismiss the Baffert horse, but it's not the kind of usual Baffert firster where I think you might be tending to lean on that one. I would just use her in this race, kind of anticipating she's not going to take as much money as some other Baffert firsters in the past. And yeah, Honor It, definitely one. And I also thought mitigation was somewhat interesting of the horses that are going to be bigger prices in here. Yeah, John Sheriff's doesn't start as many firsters as some other barns, and the pedigree here just kind of says win early into mischief out of an unbridled song mare. So I think that one's somewhat interesting. The others that are listed at short prices, I wasn't necessarily getting those win early vibes from them, but they might be quick. So we'll see. I think this is definitely just a race though to survive, to get forward to some other opinions later on.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know what to do with bicameral, if I'm saying that correctly, just because, again, I mentioned, Baltus being live and it's a short price on the morning line. Wasn't able to see any of those works, most of them over at the San Luis Rey Trading Center. So I just, I didn't know quite what to do with that one. Maybe pay attention to the board and visuals as far as her. But yeah, I think, again, we're kind of on the same page.
Move ahead to the next leg, the feature race on this card, the Grade 2 Eddie Reed going 1 1/8 on the turf. And it's just a 7-horse field, but a really strong 7-horse field. I think all the right horses among the California-based turf division are in this race. And while he's not listed as the favorite on the morning line, I kind of think you do have to start the conversation with United, because he won this race last year. He's been so dominant over a variety of distances in this division over the past couple of years, but it feels like you have to wonder if he's losing a step at this point. It's hard to really find an excuse for his last race when he was finished last in the Charles Whittingham. And this is just a stronger Grade 2 event than many of the graded stakes that United's won over the past couple of years.
Yeah, I agree. And I agree just in terms of the form cycle as well. I mean, there really wasn't any excuse. I mean, sometimes those compact fields can be like kind of tough because they take horses out of his running style, but he had everything go the right way. He was just in a great spot and just lacked kick. I mean, there was no excuse. He's coming into the race off a little bit of a break and has another break here, which isn't necessarily the most positive either, because he's been able to string races together in the past and hasn't done so. And again, like you mentioned, it's not like this division is super tough and solid. Like, he stood out in both those races. And I also think it's interesting just the fact that they took the blinkers off. And when you have a horse that's like, he was going so well and he was, performing up to par, running his races consistently, then, you can make an excuse for the Breeders' Cup turf. That's, a tough spot, whatever. Didn't handle Keeneland, which is, common for horses. But then just the blinkers coming off, had a perfect trip. It's had those layoff lines since. Just one I'm just not excited about at this point, and probably going to be a short price. And then again, in a sequence that people are going to be like, well, I have to use them. And like, you don't have to use them, but a lot of people will, like, just for that factor. And in this field, there's other horses I like. There's another horse I like quite a bit at a price. So I'm going to kind of go against him in this spot.
I've heard some chatter about this, and I know some people might kind of lean towards the viewpoint that maybe coming off Lasix this year would mess with a horse like United, who's achieved all of his success racing on Lasix. Do you kind of view that as a factor you want to consider, or do you feel like Lasix and horses coming off Lasix and all these graded stakes races at the major circuits hasn't had that much of an impact?
It's I mean, maybe too early to tell, and then it's going to be horse to horse. I mean, if that is the case, I don't think that's going to help him here. I just have to go off like what I can see with the horse and those other factors that are combined. Maybe it has to do with his recovery, the fact that he can't run on Lasix. I don't really know the kind of ins and outs of that. to put in a play, but it's not something I'm really paying attention to right now and taking me away from my handicapping, where I'm like more focused on, class and speed and form, and pace. Those factors are certainly prioritized over the Lasix conversation.
So where are you going in this race? I mean, I guess Smooth Like Straight is kind of the horse to beat. He's just been in such great form recently, and he's coming out of some really strong performances against tough horses, especially that one at Churchill too back on Derby Day. But he might get some pressure on the front end from award winner.
Yeah, from award winner, we're staying Vengeance. I mean, they might have to go just because of the post position. But he certainly fits, but kind of needs his own trip. Tends to be like need that sort of pace out in front, need the right trip. It's a little bit further in terms of distance for him, so he's going to kind of need some luck. I think it's one you want to use just because you have a horse on the front end that's sharp, and those horses are successful. I mean, award winner, he's been improving as of late. There's really nothing to knock in his most recent races, but he's going to have the challenge with Smooth Like Straight in a similar running style. But you mentioned, that Churchill Downs race, the Turf Classic. And I'm going to go back to Count Again because he had such a trip in there that was probably a little bit overlooked, where he was buried inside of horses and really never had a chance to run. And he's going to come back to California. He's been freshened, and he has Grade 1 races. Like, he's been able to compete at the Grade 1 level, and I'm a class handicapper, especially when it comes to these races on the turf. And his class stacks up, his form stacks up, his speed stacks up, and just seems like he's going to be in the right spot. I mean, Bravo taking over. I think they wanted to make a change from Hernandez, and then obviously Saez being elsewhere. So I don't really put too much stock into the rider change in this spot. And I just think he's a good horse, and if anything, is probably going to help the price, and prefer him of the two D'Amatos over Say the Word. And Say the Word is a good horse in his own right, just maybe is better a little bit longer. And then also another one that kind of needs like the right perfect trip to win.
Yeah, I love Count Again in this race as well. I've kind of been on this horse for a little while, ever since that victory at Del Mar last year in the Seabiscuit. He was so impressive that day. And obviously something happened after that in the San Gabriel, but I thought he was arguably best in the Kill Row when he was just kind of making that last move in a race that was falling apart in the very late stages, but horses weren't really successful coming from as far back as he was trying to. And I agree, he just didn't get the right trip in the Turf Classic last time, just kind of buried inside of horses for way too long. He's the kind of runner that really does need to wind up on the outside and make that long sustained run. And I think that's the kind of rider that Joe Bravo is. You can say positive and negative things about him, but he's probably going to try to launch that wide run coming around the far turn. And I think that's the right move for Count Again. So I'm just hoping he can get a clear chance at it, because I do think he's good enough to win this race. And like you, I'm kind of leaning more towards him rather than Say the Word, who has generally been successful going a little bit farther than this. I think he's gained some more versatility as he's gotten into the Phil D'Amato barn, but over this distance, I do prefer Count Again as well.
Yeah. And I think he'll be a good price. I think the morning line, they put him at 5, and I think he'll probably be close to that, because you can just see some of these other horses that are gonna get support naturally and be just a square number. And that to me is considerable value, 5-1.
Is there anybody else in this race at a price that you were looking at, or you just do think it's mostly about those main players?
I mean, that to me is like it would be a prime play in this race. I mean, I can make a case and get creative with other horses in here. I mean, Vintage Print is probably a little bit light, but a horse that's been on the improve, and that's tough to knock when you have a horse that's just improving race to race, and they're shipping in and they're bringing their rider. So maybe some positive intent. Obviously, it's been coming out of the East Coast, ran well in the Transylvania, so in his one graded stake race. So I could get creative and use him. He's going to have to get a trip and have to kind of run the race of his career. But, to me, I mean, just Count Again just seems like the right price and a prime play. And Smooth Like Straight is kind of the other one that you want to use if you're going to be a little bit on the safe side.
Now, as we move on to some of the later races in the sequence, the non-stakes events, I feel like I'm going to have to defer a little bit more to you, because these races, the claiming races, the Calbred allowance races, they do become a little bit more about who are the right trainers to take in these kinds of races and recent trends, as you were talking about. And this one, the 9th race, Calbred optional claiming N1X going 6.5 furlongs, it just seems pretty wide open. You've got some runners coming in from different circuits, a few horses that are coming off good performances at Pleasanton. How do you view at Del Mar those horses that are coming in from the lesser circuits?
Well, you mean like the lesser circuits, like the Fair Circuit and like Los Alamitos? Or the one?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I know
Or
we do have
horse.
a shipper that's coming in that's probably going to get some attention. That's why I asked. I think this is a big step up, and it is a massive step up because of the purse structure. I mean, a lot of those races are like, they're $25,000 purses, maybe 30 if at the highest. And this is a $72,000 purse. Like, this isn't messing around, right? Like, this is like that's legit money, like for this type of horse and for this type of level. So there is a class component. I mean, even Push to Start hasn't been running for the type of purse money that this is offering. So I think that comes into play, and those horses coming out of the lesser circuits could just really be up against it in terms of class. And so just with this race being like, if you're not familiar with California and not kind of following these horses, what's kind of like your opinion and where you kind of go in this race? Because I want to kind of get like an outside opinion, sort of.
Yeah, so
Even
I mean, I guess the two logical places to start would be Clem Labine, who's coming in from Pleasanton off some speed figures that look like they fit, though it's hard to assess the form from Pleasanton transitioning here. He's a horse that is based up in Northern California, and it seems like he runs well when they run him on the dirt every now and then, but that is at the lesser circuit, so it's hard to know how that's going to translate to Del Mar. Generally, my instinct would be to lean against those horses. The more intriguing one to me that's coming in from a different circuit is that horse you mentioned, Push to Start. And I've kind of been mildly familiar with this horse. I've seen some of his races, kind of watching replays for different horses over the past couple months, and I mean, he's just kind of like a modified quarter horse. He's so quick out of the gate, and the jockey just kind of has to get a real hammerlock on him just to basically keep him contained until they get to the stretch, because he kind of does want to run off on you. So for that reason, I'm a little bit concerned about Push to Start going the 6.5 furlongs here, though I do recognize he probably does have the quality to run these off their feet. I don't really trust either of these.
Yeah, I mean, the distance was a big concern because he's just lacked finish even in those shorter distance races and coming into this spot. And he's going to get in light with Piper. He's on the inside. And coming out of those shorter races, it's like they're obviously going to send and hope the best. He does kind of look like he's the quickest to the first call. So trying to use that speed in every advantage to kind of hold that speed in here. But again, could just be lacking finish late. And then as far as like Clem Labine, again, he's kind of one of those just kind of like workman type horses where he just kind of like runs his race. But he was pretty well meant at Pleasanton. He was bet down off the 6-1 morning line. And there was a loose horse near him, but it didn't really like impact him. And I just think it's kind of a step up in class and probably where he was like well meant to run 20 days ago. The horse is interesting to me in here. And again, kind of going back to a class standpoint and in terms of form as well, is the number 4, I'll Stand Taller, because he's second start of the form cycle and just kind of looked like a prep when he came back off that race at a route of ground and going up against that level company, just kind of off the layoff. Didn't have that much trouble, but just kind of looked like a race that he needed, and has the races from earlier in the season that are fast, that kind of stack up. And you can obviously give a pass to grade 3 Las Barreras Stakes, just not quite on the level, but just looks like in terms of like where he's meant to run. He won second off a layoff. He won at this distance. There's just some positive factors coming into this race, and he's interesting to me. And then O'Neill also sending out First Prez, who's a little bit tougher to get to, but he's just kind of an in and outer as far as like where he wants to be and where he wants to go. But he has races that could be competitive in here. Jazz Hands is another horse that's kind of interesting because like Redham has Jazz Hands and All Stand Taller, and Gutierrez, who's the main rider for the barn, is going to side with All Stand Taller, which I think is interesting. And no knock on Hernandez, but a good horse, probably going to show speed as well, maybe going to make things tough for Push to Start on the front end. But again, another one that's just, pretty honest type horse. Hammering Lemon is interesting to me in this race. He's going to make a second start off the claim, which is pretty good angle for Studi, a barn that doesn't have many horses. And just in terms of distance, is one that wants to be shorter. And he's going to go back on the main track. Only has one race on the main track, so it's kind of tough to know. And there was the one experiment where he was in blinkers. So just could be in the right spot. And again, they scratched out of a race at Los Alamitos. That would have been a much easier spot to run here instead. And again, the purse structure just being much greater here. So maybe some positive intent with that horse.
Yeah, I actually landed on both of the Redham horses. I mean, I agree with everything you said about All Stand Taller. He's the kind of horse that I typically like in these races, a class dropper, one that maybe looks a little bit inconsistent, but I think you can explain that inconsistency just because of the placement, and this is probably the right kind of spot for him. And as for Jazz Hands, I know he's run his much faster speed figures on the turf and even synthetic, but I mean, both of his dirt races came when he was a much younger horse as a 2-year-old, and I personally don't put a whole lot of stock in those 2-year-old speed figures. I mean, he won by open lengths at Los Alamitos first time out and seemed to handle the dirt just fine that day. And when I watch his recent turf races, I don't get like such turfy vibes from watching him run that I don't think he's a multi-surface horse like many of the square eddies tend to be. So I think that he might be able to transition back to the dirt, and he certainly has the quality if he can. So I lean towards both of those horses, All Stand Taller and Jazz Hands. But yeah, I agree with you. It's a race where you can really make a case for some bigger prices, and I would kind of veer against those horses that are the newer faces on the circuit, like the Clemel Beans and the Push to Starts. But you can definitely spread in this race.
Yeah, they're competitive races. They do kind of come up tough, so will be interesting.
Now, a race where a lot of people might like to single or lean on a horse comes up in the San Clemente, the 10th race, the penultimate leg in this pick 5 sequence. And the prohibitive favorite is going to be the number 2 Going Global, who's listed at 4-5 on the morning line. She is obviously 4 for 4 in the country for Phil D'Amato. It seems like she's gotten better with each successive start, and turning back to a mile here probably is going to just benefit her, because if anything, she seems like she's a horse who has a quick turn of foot that's going to be more effective over shorter distances. So there's a lot going for Going Global in this race, though I do feel a little bit like the price she's going to be isn't necessarily commensurate with her talents relative to some other horses in here.
I agree with that 100%. She's going to be a really short price. She's logically the horse to beat. She just hasn't done anything wrong in those races, and she is going to be the horse to beat, but it's just going to be just a super short price. And I'm just kind of thinking we probably landed on the same horse. We're not getting super creative in here. With Madone, is that who you kind of liked? I shouldn't speak for you.
No, I actually went a different direction.
Okay,
but
cool.
Go on.
Well, I'll talk about Madone, and then I want to hear about who you landed on, because this is a filly going back to her debut last year. And it was like one of those horses where I didn't like pick her. Maybe I had her like 4th or something. But as soon as she came out on the track in the post parade, it was just kind of one of those horses where I was like, oh my God, this horse is going to win. Like, they're not beating her. She just looks like just a dominant force, like just in this group, just visually. And that's before the race run. And then she was super dominant. She just made a couple moves. She closed, she was in traffic, and just a really classy performance. She came out of that race and another really solid effort in the juvenile fillies turf. And I'm like, okay, they're going into graded stakes with her. She's legit, like she's quality. And then they ran the Surfer Girl. I was like, okay, I mean, fine, like let's get a win, whatever. But then by the time she got to the Grade 1 Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies Turf, she was just a little bit over the top, but she ran a good race in there, made a move and was wide. But again, just in terms of her form cycle, I just don't think it was like the right timing. They just kind of pushed a little bit too soon in that Surfer Girl, where maybe could have waited and gone into graded stakes in better form. She came off the layoff this year on May 1st. It was a massive effort for her, considering the layoff, running in the Senorita Stakes and winning that day. And then probably, again, just in terms of timing, came back a little bit too soon. They wheeled her back in 3 weeks. They could make multiple excuses just in terms of form cycle, coming back too quick. She was wide. She was against the bias. And she was a little bit close to the pace, and that race slowed late, as we can see where, the winner came from in that race. So I can make an excuse there. She's been freshened. She runs well at Del Mar. We already know. So there's just some positives for her coming into this race. And as you mentioned, just in terms of value, speed figures in class are not that far off between Madone and Going Global, that the price compensation is just going to be there.
I guess my concern with Madone is that she seemed like a really early developing 2-year-old, and I just wonder if she's totally gone on this year. And I know she got the job done in the Senorita, and I totally agree with you about the last race. She did not get the right trip there. I didn't think that was a very good ride from Hernandez, just never getting any cover on the turf. That's not how you want to ride a horse like that. But I haven't really seen her with that explosive finish like we saw from her as a 2-year-old. So I wonder if she's one of these early developing developing horses that hasn't really taken that step forward. But I mean, she's not going to be at a short price in this race. So, or I should say, not as short of a price as Going Global. So, I mean, I don't mind her. She was my third choice in this race. I went to the other logical horse all the way on the outside, Closing Remarks. When I watched the Senorita, I felt like Closing Remarks actually ran a better race than Madone. She had that obvious trouble at the start when she clipped heels, putting her a little farther back than she really wanted to be. She had to swing so wide coming into the stretch to make her run, and it seemed almost like Victor Espinoza kind of gave up a little bit at the end, kind of realizing that the trip had probably gotten her beat by that point. And I know that she had good trips in her two prior matchups against Going Global and just couldn't quite get to her. And when you watch those races, I understand people who might say that Going Global was just kind of easing up at the end, which is why Closing Remarks was able to make up a little bit of ground on her in the final eighth of a mile each time. But I just like the way that Closing Remarks has progressed with each start, and she's got a versatile kind of running style. She doesn't have the same turn of foot as Going Global, but she just keeps coming at you. And from this outside post position, she's probably going to be a bigger price than she really deserves to be. And I'm just hoping that Umberto Rispoli can work out a trip, because to me, she was the only horse that I could point to that I thought was going to be sufficient value against the favorite.
Yeah, I agree that she certainly fits and she's been running against some of these, but does have to work a trip from the outside post. And then also, I was just a little bit concerned because she is entered to run on Friday in a stakes race. So a 7 furlong on the main track, a Calbred race. So just in terms of intent, when you're cross entered in like two different spots, where they end up going. So I would think they're going to run in this spot because Rispoli's going to be able to ride her in this stakes race where Hernandez is named on Friday. But I just kind of thought that was a little bit interesting. And in terms of the post, but she is, she's certainly logical. And then I can make a little bit of a case for Tetragonal as well. Just kind of cycling forward in her races. She showed a little bit of ability last year, had that layoff, came back. That was an excuse in the Senorita, talking about that common race, was able to improve, and then just kind of used her class, kind of took herself a little bit into a different dimension in terms of running style to get a perfect trip that has been freshened and for a live barn that could just be sitting on a big race.
Yeah, that's interesting. I actually was not aware about that with Going Global being entered later today as we record this on Friday. So it'll be interesting to see if she runs in that spot. I would imagine the fact that her last workout was so much quicker than usual on the dirt might be pushing them in that direction to perhaps try the dirt. I don't always agree with that about turf horses. Sometimes they work well in the dirt and don't run well over it. But yeah, I'll be interested to see where she goes, because she was the only horse that I could really latch onto as an alternative in here. Yeah, I have no problem with Tetragonal. I think that she showed up last time with a good effort. I like the way that she kicked for home. It's just her prior stakes tries didn't do a whole lot for me, but it's possible that she is moving forward now.
Yeah.
Let's finish things up with the last race in this sequence. It is a claiming 16,000. And non-winners of 2 lifetime. 16 down to 14 is actually the claiming price, going 6 furlongs on the dirt. And this one is a really confusing way to end the sequence. It's hard to really know where to go. I guess you could start the conversation with Traffic Stopper, who has just kind of been knocking at the door in some recent starts, is probably one of the more reliable runners in this race, but there are definitely some others that have more interesting profiles.
Yeah, Traffic Stopper is kind of one of those horses that players will just kind of see this race and the chaotic nature of it and be like, she just feels safe. Like she just feels like the safe horse that's consistent and has the good connections, and there's a lot of craziness, these kind of in and out types. So from that perspective, she could definitely win. She hasn't really done anything in her recent races at this level or similar condition to make her overwhelming, but she fits. But I just think there's other ways to kind of go, and especially because she's going to kind of be that pick by default. Number 5, Sweet Soulmate, is one of these horses that tends to run in every other pattern, and had some excuses in her first few starts, and then just was really good breaking her maiden at the maiden 30. Then obviously last time out, a little bit tougher spot, but she's again one of those that has an every other pattern and could be just out in front and clear and lone on the lead and have a pace advantage and going to get overlooked because she's kind of one of those those in and out type horses. And then Jeff Metz has a pair in here, and I think both these horses are super interesting. Chewy Good, the number 8, is going to be first off a claim, and these connections obviously looking for a horse on those other circuits to run here at Del Mar because of the ship and win bonus. And then kind of going back to her form where she was running at Oaklawn Park, she was running for a trainer called Aiden Green, and that barn was just winning everything. I mean, races they didn't even have a horse running in, they were winning. There's so lights out. So the fact that horse came off the claim and didn't run very well at Churchill Downs, I can be a little bit excusing of that. Just has been fresh in first off the claim and getting kind of back around. Not one that's super consistent, but has races that fit and maybe just some positive intent coming into this spot. And then Stablemate Heart River is another one of those. There's just kind of, in and out. She's been running on the circuit, but has run at Del Mar in the past and actually run pretty well in her races here at Del Mar last fall. Timing was a little bit off in those races, kind of had to rush back after breaking slow and racing wide on November 6th and then November 13th race, which again was a pretty good effort at this condition. She's second off the layoff in here, had a wide trip last time out at Los Alamitos, and that's a 6th place finish that'll kind of get overlooked, but it was a blanket finish for show. So if that was a 3rd place finish, she'd probably be a little bit shorter price. So those two horses are interesting to me in a pretty kind of chaotic race. I feel like I'm missing somebody. The number 1. I think I mentioned her as well.
Yeah, I wanted to get to her.
Okay, go ahead.
She's an interesting horse in here because she's just got the one dirt race in her debut, which was so long ago. And I mean, you do have to wonder a little bit about what we're going to get from a 6-year-old who has just made 4 career starts. There have obviously been some issues with this mare, but she might be able to handle the dirt. And while I do like her performances back from 2019 more than I do her recent efforts, that's why she's running in this cheap race. So she definitely could wake up a little bit on the class drop. She's definitely kind of the new face in this group that I think is the most immediately appealing.
Yeah, and I mean, again, you mentioned the debut. I think that was more a function of the slow start and then an open length winner than it was necessarily the surface. So we just haven't seen her run on the surface. And just from a physical standpoint, it's not like she's screaming I'm a turf horse, I want to only run on the grass. So a wild card on the drop. The barn already has a winner this meet. They seem to be sending in live. Their horses look well spotted. So yeah, definitely one that I'm going to keep in the mix.
Yeah, I kind of was on the same page as you in this race. A traffic stopper, she's fine. She's a horse to use, but I'm not going to lean on her. Sweet Soulmate seems very dependent on the break and the early part of the race because she just seems like one of these faint-hearted horses who needs to be on a clear lead, and if she's not, she's going to be nowhere. So I am a little bit concerned because there is a bit of pace in this race. Maybe not as quick as she is, but she does need to break and get out to the front. So it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds in the first quarter mile of the race. And yeah, I was trying to look through to find a closer because you do feel like maybe this race could fall apart a little bit if some of these horses that want to show speed can't really go the pace that a horse like Sweet Soulmate might want to set. So I was looking at both of those Jeff Metz horses. I was leaning towards the more logical one, Chewy Good, who, you make great points about her coming out of some very live barns. But I thought she faced decent fields in a couple of those starts. That $10,000 claimer last time at Churchill, I thought that was arguably even a tougher spot than this one, just kind of looking at some of the runbacks out of that race. And she's got good figures going back to her sprints for Joe Sharp earlier in her career. So I think she's fairly interesting. I don't know if she can adapt to coming from farther off the pace, which she's probably going to need to do in here. But I do think that she's a horse that you'd want to take a look at. And yeah, I would also use Angel's Advocate, who just seems like the interesting new face in here.
Yeah. I think it's definitely a race that probably the way that we're talking through it, you want to have a little bit of coverage.
So from a ticket construction standpoint, we've kind of been a little all over the place talking about multiple horses in these races. Personally, for me, I would look at the board in the first leg for the 2-year-olds, kind of get a sense of whether or not that Baffert horse is live or really dead on the board, and whether some other trainers who don't often win first time out are taking a lot of money. But I would kind of, going in, I would lean more towards the Mirasol mitigation and honor it, and then see if anybody else is worth using in the Eddie Reed. I would lean mostly on Count Again, Smooth Like Street being a little bit of a backup. spreading a little bit in the 9th and 11th race. And in the San Clemente, I would kind of push Going Global and Closing Remarks, maybe even pushing Going Global a little bit more because she obviously is the more likely winner, and Closing Remarks is just the alternative who's less likely to win, but maybe is more of a type of horse to offer value on the win end. If Closing Remarks scratches, I would kind of reluctantly just lean heavily on Going Global in that race.
Yeah, so from a ticket standpoint, I think the same thing in the 7th. I think kind of just have a couple horses that I want to use in this spot, but willing to be flexible in terms of looking at the board and looking at the horses out on the track, just kind of make some determining factors on that, maybe adding or subtracting from that perspective. Count Again is going to be a key in the 8th race. A horse I'm going to kind of single around. So again, if I'm going to play a sequence, I'm looking at it from like a perspective of like, I want to make money in this sequence. I don't just want to hit it. And I think that probably like annoys Brisnet a little bit, because sometimes I'll be like, hey, do you want to write up a ticket for this? And I look at a sequence, I'm like, not really. Like, I don't, and then I'll see what I like. I'm like, okay, I'll take a swing because I think it's one that, I feel confident in like where I want to play. So Count Again kind of being like a prime, because I think it's going to be a good price in there. And then in the 9th race, we talk about some of those horses to spread. All Stand Taller, Jazz Hands, Hammering Lemon, going to use those primarily. And then again, I want to kind of key up Madone, just because I think just the price discrepancy between her and Going Global is just going to be so big, and Going Global will be on every single ticket. So taking a little bit of stand there again, just because I don't really like any like big long shot prices to where using Going Global with some of these other horses is going to be that much of a payout kind of in the end. And then spreading Sweet Soulmate, perhaps having that pace advantage using those Team Mets horses, Chewy Good, Heart River, Angel's Advocate, and then Traffic Stopper is a little bit more logical.
Yeah, I like the way that you summarize that. And you do want to go into these sequence kind of having a take where you feel like you can go against the grain a little bit to try to make money, because, not every sequence is worth hitting. If you feel like it's going to be really chalky, maybe that's not the sequence for you. So yeah, like you were saying, Count Again would definitely inflate the payout of this if he goes off at that 5-1, or, even in a multi-race sequence, if he's not quite that price, he's the kind of horse that's going to beat the 2 favorites. So you would get a better payout there. And, I was saying I would reluctantly lean on a horse like Going Global, because I do have some opinions in the other races that I feel like could make the sequence pay a little better, but I would not want to have both favorites winning the stakes, because that would severely depress the possible payout here. So, hopefully we're right about some of these long shots opinions and the legs that seem a little more wide open, but this does seem like a sequence that could go a number of ways depending on payout.
Yeah, I think it's a good sequence altogether. At least consider, looking at it and looking at it from the standpoint of, trying to make money in it, which should always be the standpoint.
Well, Emily, I really appreciated you coming back on the podcast. Had a great time talking about these races. So hopefully we gave out some good opinions, and look forward to chatting with you in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks again for the opportunity, and thank you to everybody who's listening.
Everybody, thanks for listening this week. As Emily said, remember, you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, wherever you get your podcast. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Forum channel. Some housekeeping. I'm probably going to take a couple weeks off of these podcasts coming up. Kind of waiting for my usual co-host, Craig, to return, and then we'll talk a little bit about having maybe some guests on in the future. But I'll be doing some traveling over the next couple of weeks, heading up to Saratoga for a bit. So you might not see too many of these podcasts coming out over the next couple of weeks, but we should make a return to the regular schedule in early August. So thanks for tuning into the podcast this week, and stay tuned for news about when we'll be resuming in the future.